November 25th, 1107. A 16-year-old king with leprosy stands in the sand near Ramla, watching dust rise on the horizon. Behind him, fewer than 500 armored knights. Ahead, Saladin's army, thousands strong, sweeping toward Jerusalem. The math doesn't work. Everyone knows it. His own advisors know it. But Baldwin IV isn't doing math. He's doing something far more dangerous. He orders the true cross raised. He dismounts, prays in the dirt in front of his men, then climbs back into the saddle. One charge. That's all they'll get. What happens next will make Saladin, the most feared commander in the Muslim world, flee for his life on the back of a camel. This is how 500 knights broke an empire. But to understand how we got here, to this impossible moment in the sand, we need to rewind. Because this disaster didn't start on the battlefield. It started with a decision made hundreds of miles away. A decision that left Jerusalem naked. Picture the kingdom of Jerusalem in the autumn of 1177. It's not the mighty fortress you might imagine. It's a thin strip of coastline. A collection of castles and cities clinging to the edge of a hostile world. Surrounded on all sides by enemies who want it erased from the map. And the only thing keeping it alive? Its army. Not a large army. Never a large army. The Crusader states could never match their Muslim neighbors in raw numbers. What they had instead was quality. Heavy cavalry. Knights encased in iron, mounted on war horses bred for violence. Pound for pound, the most devastating shock force on earth. But here's the thing about a small, elite army. You can't split it. You can't be in two places at once. You need every knight, every horse, every lance concentrated together to have any chance against the vast armies of Egypt and Syria. So what did the Kingdom of Jerusalem do in the autumn of 1177? They split their army. Philip of Flanders had arrived from Europe with a fresh force of Crusaders, ambitious, eager for glory, and absolutely convinced he knew better than the locals. He wanted to strike north, to attack the great city of Hama in Syria. It was a bold plan, an aggressive plan. It was also a catastrophically stupid plan. Because while Philip marched north with the bulk of Jerusalem's fighting force, he left the southern border virtually undefended. The road from Egypt, Saladin's Egypt, lay open. Think about that for a moment. The greatest military mind in the Islamic world, commanding the largest army in the region, and someone just handed him an open door. You think Saladin didn't notice? Now, who was Saladin in 1177? Not yet the legend, not yet the man who would recapture Jerusalem. But he was getting there, fast. He had unified Egypt under his rule. He was systematically absorbing the fractured Muslim states around him. And he had one overriding obsession: the destruction of the Crusader kingdoms. Saladin was patient, calculating. He watched. He waited. And when he saw Philip of Flanders march north with Jerusalem's army, he saw something beautiful. He saw opportunity. Within weeks, Saladin mobilized. His army poured out of Egypt. Estimates vary, but we're talking somewhere between 20 and 30,000 men. Maybe more. Cavalry, infantry, archers, Mamluks, a tide of steel and horses sweeping up from the Sinai, and their target? Jerusalem itself. But here's what's crucial to understand. Saladin wasn't marching to battle. He was raiding. His army spread out across the countryside, foraging, pillaging, moving fast. Why waste time in formation when there's no one to fight? His scouts told him the Frankish army was far to the north. By the time they could respond, Saladin would be at the gates of the holy city. This wasn't an invasion. This was a victory lap. Or so he thought. Meanwhile, in the south, a teenage king was watching his kingdom die. Baldwin IV, 16 years old, already showing the signs of the leprosy that would kill him within a decade. Fingers growing numb, his face beginning to change. Every day, his own body betraying him a little more. But his mind? His mind was sharp as Damascus steel. Baldwin had stayed in the south while Philip marched north. Call it caution, call it instinct. Whatever it was, it meant he was the only thing standing between Saladin and Jerusalem. And what did he have to stand with? Almost nothing. A skeleton garrison. A handful of knights who hadn't marched with Philip. Local militias, not enough, not nearly enough, but then the messages started arriving. Desperate messages from across the kingdom. Saladin is coming. Saladin is burning everything. Saladin will be at Jerusalem within days. Baldwin had two choices. He could retreat behind the walls of Jerusalem and pray they held. Wait for Philip to march back south. Play defense and hope for the best. That was the safe choice, the sensible choice. Baldwin didn't make the safe choice. He sent out the call. Every knight who could ride. Every sergeant who could hold a lance. Every Turcopole, those mixed heritage light cavalry who knew the land and could fight in ways the heavy knights couldn't. Everyone. They gathered at Ascalon, the great coastal fortress, and that's where Baldwin found his ace in the hole. The Knights Templar, 80 of them, under their Grand Master, Odo de Saint-Amand. 80 warrior monks who had sworn their lives to the defense of the Holy Land. 80 men who feared nothing, not death, not pain, not impossible odds. 80 men who were worth 5 times their number in ordinary soldiers. With the Templars added to his force, Baldwin had assembled something that almost looked like an army. Almost. Maybe 375 knights total. Maybe 400. Some accounts push it to 500 if you count everyone who could theoretically couch a lance. Plus infantry. Plus Turcopoles. Plus servants and squires who might fight if it came to it. Let's be generous. Let's say Baldwin had 4,000 men total, of which fewer than 500 were heavy, cavalry. Saladin had at least 26,000, 6-to-1 odds, maybe worse. And Baldwin looked at those odds and said, "We ride." Here's what you need to understand about Baldwin's decision. This wasn't bravery. This wasn't recklessness. This was calculation. Cold, desperate, brilliant calculation. Baldwin knew something that Saladin didn't know he knew. The Ayyubid army wasn't concentrated. It was scattered across miles of countryside, broken into raiding parties, spread thin to maximize plunder. Saladin's soldiers were carrying loot, not weapons. They were herding stolen cattle, not watching for enemies. They weren't an army anymore. They were a mob with treasure, and mobs can be broken. But only if you hit them before they reform. Only if you catch them while they're still drunk on easy victory. Only if you move faster than anyone thinks possible. Baldwin had one advantage. No one expected him to attack. Why would he? He was a sick teenager with a handful of knights. The sensible thing, the sane thing, was to hide behind walls and wait for rescue. Every military textbook ever written said the same thing. When outnumbered, defend. Don't attack. Never attack. Saladin was counting on that. His scouts were watching the roads north, waiting for Philip's army to turn back. They weren't watching the coast. They weren't watching Ascalon. They should have been. The Frankish force moved out of Ascalon like ghosts, fast, silent, hugging the coast where the sand was firm and the horses could run. They didn't stop to rest. They didn't stop to eat. They barely stopped to water the horses. Every hour mattered. Every minute. Saladin's army was moving north toward Jerusalem. If Baldwin's force didn't intercept them before they consolidated, it was over. Not just the battle. The kingdom. Jerusalem would fall. The Christian presence in the Holy Land would be erased. No pressure. Picture the scene, a column of iron men thundering up the coast, the Mediterranean crashing against the shore on their left, the dust of their passage rising behind them like a signal fire. At the head, a boy king who couldn't fully feel his own hands anymore, gripping his reins through sheer will. Behind him, Odo de Saint-Amand and his Templars. These weren't ordinary knights. They were fanatics in the truest sense, men who had abandoned lands, titles, families, everything, for a chance to die fighting for God. Their white mantles snapped in the wind, their faces were stone, and behind them, the rest. Knights from Jerusalem, knights from Ascalon, sergeants in lighter armor, Turcopoles on their swift ponies, infantry struggling to keep pace, a desperate rabble held together by faith and fear and the sheer magnetic force of a king who refused to accept mathematics. They rode through the night. They rode through the next day. They rode until the horses were foaming and the men were swaying in their saddles. And then, near Montgisard, they saw the dust, Saladin's dust. Miles of it, a brown haze, hanging over the hills like a sandstorm. Beneath that haze, an army that outnumbered them 6-1, maybe more. This was the moment, the point of no return. Baldwin could still turn back, could still retreat to Ascalon or make for Jerusalem's walls. No one would blame him. No one would call him a coward. He had done more than anyone expected already. But Baldwin didn't turn back. He kept riding, straight toward the dust, straight toward the impossible. Why? What was going through his mind in that moment? We'll never know for certain. But we can guess. Baldwin had lived his entire life knowing he was dying. The leprosy that was eating him alive had been diagnosed when he was 9 years old. 7 years he had lived with that sentence. 7 years of watching his body fail while his mind stayed sharp and trapped inside it. Maybe that changes how you see risk. Maybe when you're already dead, you stop being afraid of dying. Or maybe Baldwin just did the math differently than everyone else. He saw an army that wasn't ready. He saw an enemy who didn't expect him. He saw one chance, one slim, desperate, impossible chance to save everything he loved. And he took it. November 25th, 1177, the feast of St. Catherine of Alexandria, late afternoon, the shadows growing long across the hills of Montgisard. Saladin received the reports and didn't believe them. A Frankish army? Here? Impossible. His scouts had been watching the north. The Christian forces were hundreds of miles away, still fumbling around in Syria with that fool Philip of Flanders. But the reports kept coming, more urgent each time. Christians approaching, Christians in battle formation, Christians flying the banner of Jerusalem. And then the final report, the one that turned Saladin's blood to ice. They're carrying the true cross, the holiest relic in Christendom. A fragment, supposedly, of the actual cross on which Christ was crucified. The Crusaders only brought it out for the most desperate battles. Its presence meant one thing. They intended to fight. Here. Now. To the death. Saladin scrambled to respond. Messengers galloped out to recall his scattered forces. Officers screamed at men to drop their loot and form ranks. Cavalry units tried to coalesce from a dozen different directions. But there wasn't enough time. That was Baldwin's whole bet, that there wouldn't be enough time. The Frankish army crested the final hill and saw their enemy spread below them like a broken mosaic. Clusters of soldiers here and there. Some mounted, some on foot. Some still loading plunder onto pack animals. Some running toward the sound of horns. None of them ready. None of them in formation. Baldwin halted his force. What happened next would be remembered for 1,000 years. The king dismounted. In full view of both armies, Baldwin IV, 16 years old, rotting alive from leprosy, facing annihilation, climbed down from his horse. He walked to where the true cross was held, by the Bishop of Bethlehem. And he knelt in the dirt. He prayed. Not quietly, not privately. He prayed so his men could see him, so Saladin's scouts could see him, so God himself could see him. What did he say? What words does a dying boy find when he's about to lead 400 men against an empire? The chronicles don't tell us, but they tell us what happened when he finished. He stood. He climbed back onto his horse. He turned to face his army. Those few hundred knights, those exhausted infantry, those terrified men who had followed him into the impossible. And he gave the order. Charge. The sound of a Crusader cavalry charge was unlike anything else on earth. First, the thunder. Hundreds of war horses accelerating from a walk to a trot to a canter to a full gallop. Hooves pounding the earth like drums, like heartbeats, like the hammering of doom itself. The ground shook. Men miles away could feel it in their bones. Then, the visual. A wall of iron descending the hill. Lances, lowered in perfect parallel lines, shields up, horses snorting, eyes rolling, trained to bite and kick and trample. The Templars in front, their white mantles streaming behind them like the wings of avenging angels. And at the center of it all, a teenage king with a crown on his helmet and death in his eyes. The Ayyubid soldiers who saw them coming had perhaps 30 seconds to make peace with God. 30 seconds. That's all the warning they got. Imagine being an Ayyubid soldier in that moment. You've spent the last week in paradise. Easy marching. No resistance. Villages that surrender without a fight. Loot piling up faster than you can carry it. Your officers told you the Christian army was far away. They told you Jerusalem would fall without a battle. And now there's a wall of screaming iron knights 40 seconds from your face. What do? You run. That's not cowardice. That's physics. An unformed infantry unit cannot stop a heavy cavalry charge. It's not about bravery or training or willpower. It's about mass times velocity. A knight on a warhorse weighs over a ton moving at 30 miles per hour. That's more kinetic energy than a medieval cannon. And there are hundreds of them coming at you in a solid line. If you're not in formation, shields locked, spears braced, ranks tight, you're not a soldier. You're a speed bump. The Crusader charge hit Saladin's army like a hammer hitting glass. The first rank simply ceased to exist. Men and horses went down in a tangle of screaming flesh. Lances punched through armor, through shields, through bodies. The Templars carved a corridor of death straight through the center of the Ayyubid position. And then came the swords. When a lance breaks or gets stuck in a body, you drop it and draw steel. Now it's close work. Brutal work. War horses biting and kicking. Knights hacking down at anyone within reach. Blood spraying across white Templar mantles until they ran red. But here's the thing about shock and awe. It doesn't just kill the men it touches. It kills the courage of every man who watches. The Ayyubid soldiers in the second rank saw the first rank disintegrate. They saw their comrades trampled, impaled, cut down like wheat. They saw that wall of iron coming for them next. And they broke, not retreated. Broke. There's a difference. A retreat is organized, controlled. You fall back to a secondary position, reform your lines, prepare to fight again. A rout is something else entirely. A rout is when an army stops being an army and becomes a mob of terrified individuals all trying to save themselves. A rout is when discipline evaporates and panic spreads faster than any plague. A rout is what happened to Saladin's army at Montgisard. It started in the center, where the Templars had punched through, men throwing down their weapons, men shoving past their comrades, men trampling each other in their desperation to get away from those blood-soaked knights. Then it spread, like fire through dry grass. The panic leapt from unit to unit. Soldiers who hadn't even seen the fighting yet heard the screaming, saw the running, felt the terror in the air, and they ran too. Within minutes, the entire Ayyubid army was in flight. 26,000 men. Running from fewer than 500 knights. How is that possible? How does a force that outnumbered its enemy 6-1 simply evaporate? Because armies aren't just collections of soldiers. They're organisms. living things held together by invisible bonds of discipline, trust, and shared purpose. When those bonds break, the organism dies. It doesn't matter how many cells it has. A corpse with 1 billion cells is still just a corpse. Saladin's army died at Montgisard. Not from the lances and swords. Those killed hundreds, maybe thousands. The army died from fear, from shock, from the sudden catastrophic realization that everything they'd been told was wrong, and death was coming for them all. And where was Saladin himself? The center of the nightmare. The Sultan had been trying to rally his personal guard, the elite Mamluks who formed his bodyguard, the best soldiers in his entire army. If anyone could hold, they could. If anyone could turn the tide, they could. They couldn't. The Frankish charge smashed into Saladin's guard like a battering ram into a wooden door. The Mamluks fought. God, they fought. These were proud men, skilled men, men who had never run from anything in their lives. They died where they stood, selling their lives for seconds, trying to buy their sultan time to escape. It wasn't enough. Saladin's horse was killed under him. Let that sink in. The most powerful man in the Islamic world, the terror of Christendom, was knocked off his horse in the middle of a collapsing battlefield. Around him, his bodyguards were being slaughtered. Above him, Frankish knights were hacking at anything that moved. He was seconds from death. And then someone, we don't know who, the chronicles don't say, someone shoved a camel at him, a racing camel. Fast, enduring, able to outrun any war horse over distance. Saladin climbed onto that camel, and he fled. The Sultan of Egypt and Syria, commander of the greatest army in the Middle East, fled the field of Montgisard on the back of a racing camel, his guard dead behind him, his army dissolving into chaos around him. He didn't stop running until he reached Egypt. But the battle wasn't over. Not yet. Baldwin could have let them go. He'd won. Against all odds, against all logic, against everything that should have been possible, he'd won. His men were exhausted. Their horses were blown. They'd been riding for days and fighting for hours. No one would have blamed him for stopping. Baldwin didn't stop. The pursuit began before the rout was even complete. Every knight who could still ride, every Turcopole with a horse that could gallop. They chased the fleeing Ayyubids north, east, south. Every direction the panicked soldiers scattered, and they kept killing. This is the part the heroic stories don't emphasize. The pursuit after a rout isn't glorious. It isn't noble, it's slaughter. Men running in terror, cut down from behind. Men begging for mercy, shown none. Men drowning in rivers they tried to swim. Men dying of thirst in the desert because they ran without water. The chronicles say the killing went on for 12 miles. 12 miles of bodies. 12 miles of blood. By the time it was over, Saladin had lost the majority of his army. Not just defeated, destroyed. Thousands dead on the field. Thousands more dead in the pursuit. Thousands more scattered across the countryside, trying to find their way back to Egypt in small groups, many of whom would never make it. Baldwin's losses? A few hundred at most? The impossible had happened. When the sun rose on November 26, 1177, the hills of Montgisard looked like the end of the world. Bodies everywhere, thousands of them, covering the slopes, filling the ravines, floating in the streams. Ayyubid soldiers in their colored robes, Mamluk cavalry in their fine armor, horses, camels, pack animals still laden with the plunder that would never reach Egypt, and walking among them, exhausted beyond words, the men who had done the impossible. The Frankish knights could barely stay upright. Their horses were ruined. Many would never carry a rider again. Their swords were notched, their lances shattered, their armor dented and splashed with blood that wasn't their own. They had ridden for days, fought for hours, pursued for miles. They had won, but winning felt strange, hollow, like waking from a fever dream and not quite believing you're still alive. These men had ridden into battle expecting to die. They had made their peace with God, said their final prayers, charged into an army that outnumbered them 6-1. And somehow, impossibly, supernaturally, they were still breathing. Baldwin IV sat on his horse and surveyed the carnage. What was going through his mind? Triumph? Relief? Exhaustion? We don't know. The chronicles don't record his words in that moment. Maybe he didn't have any. Maybe some victories are too big for words. But we know what he did next. He gave thanks. The date was November 25th, the feast of St. Catherine of Alexandria. Baldwin decided this was no coincidence. God had delivered them on the saint's own day. The victory belonged to her. So Baldwin made a vow. On the site of the battle, he would build a monastery dedicated to St. Catherine, a monument to the miracle, a reminder for all time of what had happened when 400 knights rode against an empire. That monastery was built. It stood for years, a stone testament to the impossible. Pilgrims came from across Christendom to see the place where Saladin's army died, where a boy king with leprosy broke the greatest military power in the Islamic world. The monastery is gone now. Time and war and the shifting sands of history erased it. But the Ain Sur memory remains. The Battle of Montgisard, the miracle in the hills. But here's what the triumphant stories don't tell you. They don't tell you that Baldwin rode back to Jerusalem with hands he could barely feel. The leprosy was progressing. Every year, more of his body failed. He had won a kingdom's survival, but he couldn't win the war against his own flesh. They don't tell you that the Crusader army was shattered too. Oh, they won. They won completely. But winning cost them. Horses that couldn't be replaced. Knights who would take months to recover. Armor and weapons that needed repair. The kingdom of Jerusalem had thrown everything it had into one desperate gamble, and even in victory, they were exhausted. They don't tell you that Saladin survived. That's the part that matters most. Saladin escaped, humiliated, yes. Defeated, yes. But alive. And Saladin was not a man who forgot defeats. He was not a man who accepted humiliation. He was a man who learned. The ride back to Egypt nearly killed him. What was left of his army straggled home in pieces, starving, demoralized, broken. Some sources say only 1/10 of his force made it back. Others are less generous. Saladin himself was sick for weeks. The physical and psychological toll of Montgisard had pushed him to the edge. There were moments in those dark weeks when he must have wondered if his dream was over, if Allah had turned against him, if the Crusaders were truly under divine protection. But Saladin was not a man who stayed down. He rebuilt, slowly at first, then faster. New soldiers recruited from Egypt and Syria. New alliances forged with other Muslim rulers. New strategies developed, learning from every mistake he'd made at Montgisard. He had been caught unprepared. He would never be caught unprepared again. He had been scattered and disorganized. He would never fight disorganized again. He had underestimated the Franks. He would never underestimate them again. The defeat at Montgisard didn't destroy Saladin. It refined him. Like a sword in a forge, the heat and pressure of that catastrophic loss burned away his weaknesses and left something harder, something sharper, something far more dangerous. And the kingdom of Jerusalem? What did they do with their miracle? They wasted it. Oh, not immediately. For a few years, things looked bright. Baldwin IV was hailed as a hero throughout Christendom, the boy king who broke Saladin, the leper who saved Jerusalem. Poems were written about him. Songs were sung. But Baldwin was still dying. Every year the leprosy took more. His fingers, his toes, his face, his vision. By his early 20s he was blind, unable to walk, ruling from a litter carried by servants. And around him the vultures gathered. The nobility of Jerusalem began fighting over the succession. Who would rule when Baldwin died? His sister Sibylla? Her husband Guy de Lusignan, a man Baldwin despised? The intrigues multiplied, the factions formed. The unity that had made Montgisard possible slowly corroded. Baldwin watched it happen. Trapped in his failing body, sharp mind still working, he watched his kingdom tear itself apart. He tried to stop it. He named his nephew as heir. He tried to exclude Guy de Lusignan from power. He fought, with every breath he had left, to preserve what he had bled for at Montgisard. It wasn't enough. Baldwin IV died in 1185. He was 24 years old. He had been king for 11 years. 11 years of war, of pain, of slowly watching his own body betray him, while he fought to hold together a kingdom surrounded by enemies. He deserved better than what came next. 2 years after Baldwin's death, it all fell apart. Guy de Lusignan, the man Baldwin had tried so hard to keep from power, was now king of Jerusalem. And Guy was about to make every mistake Baldwin had spent his life avoiding. In 1187, Saladin invaded again. This time he wasn't raiding, he wasn't foraging. He had learned his lesson. His army was concentrated, disciplined, ready for battle. And Guy walked right into the trap, the Battle of Hattin, July 4th, 1187. 10 years after Montgisard. Guy de Lusignan did everything wrong, everything Baldwin would never have done. He marched his army across waterless terrain in the middle of summer. He let Saladin choose the ground. He allowed his forces to become strung out and exhausted before the battle even began. And Saladin? Saladin did everything right. He had waited 10 years for this. 10 years of planning, 10 years of building, 10 years of remembering the humiliation of Montgisard, the feeling of fleeing on a camel while his army died behind him. Now it was his turn. The Crusader army was surrounded, cut off from water, baking under the July sun. Saladin's archers poured arrows into them for hours. When the Frankish knights finally charged, desperate, dehydrated, half mad from thirst, they charged into prepared positions, into fresh troops, into a trap. It was a massacre. The kingdom of Jerusalem died at Hattin. Not all at once. Cities held out for weeks, months, some even years. But the army was gone. The knights were dead or captured. The true cross, the same relic Baldwin had raised at Montgisard, was taken by Saladin's soldiers. Within months, Jerusalem itself fell. Saladin rode through the gates of the holy city, and the Christian kingdom that had stood for nearly a century was effectively finished. The bill had come due. And here's the tragedy, the unbearable, heartbreaking tragedy. It didn't have to happen. If Baldwin had lived, if his body hadn't betrayed him, if he'd had another 10 years, another 20 years, to lead and to plan and to keep the factions in line, would Hattin have happened? We'll never know. History doesn't deal in hypotheticals. But we know this. As long as Baldwin IV drew breath, he never lost a major battle. He fought Saladin again and again, at Montgisard, at Jacob's Ford, at Beirut, at a dozen smaller engagements. Sometimes he won. Sometimes he fought to a draw. But he never led his army into a catastrophe. Guy de Lusignan managed it in his first major campaign. Some men are born to lead. Some men have leadership thrust upon them, and some men should never be allowed anywhere near a throne. Baldwin was the first kind. Guy was the last. So what do we take from Montgisard? What does this impossible battle teach us 800 years later? Let's be clear about what it wasn't. It wasn't magic. It wasn't supernatural intervention. It wasn't God reaching down and smiting the enemies of Christendom. Whatever Baldwin believed, and he clearly believed divine favor was with him, the victory at Montgisard had earthly explanations. It was timing. Baldwin caught Saladin at exactly the right moment. Not a day earlier, his army wouldn't have been assembled. Not a day later, Saladin's forces would have consolidated. The window was narrow, maybe hours wide, and Baldwin hit it perfectly. It was concentration. The Crusaders understood something that seems obvious but is incredibly hard to execute. A small force that stays together will beat a large force that's spread out. Every single knight at Montgisard was in that charge. Every lance was pointed at the same spot. They fought as a fist, not as fingers. Saladin's army was scattered across miles of countryside. When the hammer fell, each piece was alone. And alone, piece by piece, they broke. It was surprise. Saladin didn't expect a fight. His scouts were watching the wrong direction. His soldiers were carrying loot instead of weapons. Psychologically, they had already won. Jerusalem was days away, and no one was coming to stop them. The shock of Baldwin's charge wasn't just physical, it was mental. It shattered the assumption of easy victory and replaced it with sudden, terrifying death. Men who think they're safe don't fight well when they discover they're not. And it was leadership. Baldwin IV had every excuse to fail. He was 16. He was sick. He was outnumbered 6-1. His kingdom's main army was hundreds of miles away, led by a man who'd ignored his advice. He could have hidden behind walls. He could have waited for rescue. He could have done the sensible thing. Instead, he did the impossible thing. He rode out to meet annihilation with 400 knights and a prayer. And when the moment came, that crucial, irreplaceable moment when the charge would either break the enemy or bounce off uselessly, he was at the front, leading, a dying boy showing grown men how to be brave. You can't buy that. You can't train that. You can't fake that. Either you have it or you don't. Baldwin had it. But here's the final lesson. The hardest one. Sometimes you do everything right. You time it perfectly. You concentrate your forces. You catch the enemy off guard. You lead from the front with courage that borders on insanity, and you still only buy time. Baldwin's miracle at Montgisard didn't save Jerusalem forever. It saved Jerusalem for 10 years. 1 decade, that's all. 10 years of borrowed time before the same enemy came back stronger, smarter, and ready for revenge. Was it worth it? Ask the people who lived those 10 years. Ask the children born in Jerusalem between 1177 and 1187 who got to grow up because a teenage king refused to accept mathematics. Ask the pilgrims who walked the streets of the Holy City for another decade because 400 knights decided that impossible was just a word. Baldwin couldn't save his kingdom forever. No one can save anything forever. Time defeats everything eventually. Every kingdom, every empire, every cause worth fighting for. But he saved it for long enough. Long enough for people to live. Long enough for children to be born. Long enough for prayers to be said in the church of the Holy Sepulchre. For markets to bustle in the streets of Acre. For life to go on in a thin strip of land that a dying boy refused to surrender. That's what heroes do. They don't win forever. They win long enough. November 25th, 1177. A 16-year-old king with leprosy stands in the sand near Ramla. Behind him, fewer than 500 knights. Ahead, an empire. The math doesn't work, everyone knows it. But Baldwin isn't doing math. He's buying time. And in the end, that's all any of us can do.